On July 4th, 1776, in the midst of the American Revolution, the colonies formally severed their ties to England. The men behind the movement, the Founding Fathers, had risked, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on an ideal. And now look to create not just a new nation, but a new world. But unlike the monarchies of Europe and Asia, the new American government would eventually be based on the ancient philosophies of Greece and Rome.
When it took you 4 days to get from Virginia to New York, in the middle of the night, with their kerosene lamps and their candles, they read the ancient Greek classics. How did they found the United States? On principles of the ancient world.
Having a bunch of men, geniuses in their own right, at all levels, gathered at one point in time to try to come up with a new experiment for humanity. It is extraordinary. The Romans used to call it fortuna, or in other words, when the gods conspire on your behalf.
After the war, on July 16, 1790, plans were announced for the construction of a national capital to be built on the banks of the Potomac River. Named after George Washington, the new nation's first president, it would be designed to resemble classic Greco-Roman architecture. But why? What was the reason behind the Founding Fathers' near obsession with the ancient world?
In the 5th century, 4th century before Christ, there was a very active debate in regard to the question of extraterrestrial life. The atomists, being Democritus, Leucippus, Epicurus, and Lucretius, all believed in the plurality of worlds or believed in extraterrestrial life.
For the Founding Fathers, this idea of the plurality of worlds was well known as one of the cornerstones of ancient philosophy, one that was finding greater popularity in what was known in the 18th century as the Age of Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment was a social movement that said we should look at the universe in a rational way. And that was the hub of the wheel, so to speak. And from that hub, many spokes came out. You had a concern with science, and you had belief in the plurality of worlds, which seems scientifically plausible.
The Enlightenment figures at least half, including scientists, political theorists, philosophers, literary people, talked about extraterrestrials in their writings. It was very widespread in 18th century thought.
Even one of the most prominent astronomers of the time, William Herschel, believed that intelligent life existed elsewhere in the universe.
His claim to fame is he discovered the planet Uranus. He also discovered a couple of moons of Jupiter and a couple of moons of Saturn. And he built hundreds of telescopes, including the largest one of its day.
He has a 40-inch reflecting telescope. This is an enormous instrument anywhere in the world at that time. So he now has the ability to observe all sorts of wonders of the universe. So now the idea of the plurality of worlds gains credence with this particular scientist and observer.
Regularly in his writings about the planets, he referred to the inhabitants of Jupiter, Saturn, or Uranus.
Herschel was instrumental in furthering the debate about the possibility of extraterrestrial life. But perhaps most influential of all was Benjamin Franklin.
Ben Franklin has been called the first American. He was an author and a printer. He was a scientist and an inventor, and also a politician and a statesman. He was a profound thinker and an intellectual. For Benjamin Franklin, belief in extraterrestrials was part of a scientific view of the world.
One way Franklin used to disseminate his thoughts on extraterrestrial life was in his own publication, the immensely popular Poor Richard's Almanac.
In Poor Richard's Almanac, he suggests that it's the opinion of scientists that other planets are habitable, that there are beings on there. And he presents this in a sort of matter-of-fact way. It's kind of surprising, I think, probably even to most historians, the way in which this seems to be something which he takes for granted. It's just assumed that way.
In 1728, Benjamin Franklin wrote, "I believe that man is not the most perfect being but one. So there are many degrees of being superior to him." Franklin essentially suggested that extraterrestrial life exists.
The United States officially declared its independence from Great Britain in 1776. And just 14 years later, a report of the first UFO sighting in American history appeared in the newly published journals of John Winthrop, the second governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. His journals, which are now known as A History of New England, 1630 to 1649, are still considered the preeminent record for that period in American history. When the journals were finally published in 1790, over 140 years after Winthrop's death, they were found to contain an alarming account of a possible close encounter over Boston's Muddy River.
One night in March of 1639, James Everell, who was described as being a sober and discreet man, and two of his companions boarded a little boat in the Muddy River of Boston. As they paddled along the river, they saw a great bright light that hovered in the sky. As they watched, the light flared up and then contracted into what they described as the figure of a swine. It's difficult to imagine anybody seriously reporting a sighting of a glowing flying pig. Looking at the sighting, one can't help but wonder if they were struggling to describe an oval-shaped fuselage and four short, what we might now call landing struts or landing gear, in a way that made sense in the 17th century.
Winthrop's account states that the object moved swift as an arrow, jetting back and forth, as well as up and down, for 2 to 3 hours. And when it finally disappeared, the 3 passengers in the boat, who had been drifting downstream the entire time, were astonished to find themselves back at the point where they began their trip.
What Winthrop describes in his journal is really difficult to explain. Certainly, it seems hard to fathom that for 2 or 3 hours, 3 men in a boat watched a bright light moving around in the sky over the city of Boston. And it seems almost inconceivable that their boat could have been drawn back against the tide without them noticing it. These type of strange and inexplicable phenomena are now associated with the phenomena that's called alien abduction.
And as the abduction cases evolved, you heard people say, all of a sudden, everything around them was slowing way, way down. And they associate the slowing way, way down with whatever this event is that we call the human abduction syndrome.
Could this event at Muddy River be not only North America's first documented UFO sighting, but also the first account of an alien abduction? Those who believe the account in Winthrop's journals was an actual alien encounter point to the last line of his report, which states, other credible persons saw the same light. By the time Winthrop's history was published in 1790, the debate over the possibility of extraterrestrial life was more heated than ever before. In fact, the question of whether life existed on other planets had become so hotly contested, it caused one of America's founding fathers, Thomas Paine, to be unofficially exiled to Europe.
Thomas Paine enters the extraterrestrial life debate in a very dramatic way. He was an Englishman, but famous American patriot. 1793, Thomas Paine publishes a book called The Age of Reason. And in The Age of Reason, he makes one of the most vigorous attacks on Christianity ever made. The bottom line on it is, he says you must believe in extraterrestrials. If you know any modern astronomy, the idea of God made the entire universe going from planet to planet, redeeming people, is just impossible to believe. That creates a sensation. Thousands of copies of the book were sold.
In December of 1793, Thomas Paine was arrested in France as a result of supporting a political party that was no longer in power. When the American ambassador refused to speak on his behalf, Paine believed that George Washington had abandoned him because of his writings supporting the idea of extraterrestrial life and refuting traditional Christianity. In 1802, he was invited back to America by the third president, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, an intellectual, was considered a genius by many in his time, both for his skill as a statesman and his scientific aptitude. And some believe he was also a proponent, like his contemporaries Ben Franklin and John Adams, in the concept of the plurality of worlds.
The concept of a plurality of worlds was a very widely accepted concept in the 18th century. People like John Adams and Thomas Paine didn't view extraterrestrial life as a possibility, but rather as a matter of fact that everybody knew to be true.
Alexandria, Virginia, 1791. In a full Masonic ceremony on the edge of the Potomac River, George Washington lays the first cornerstone, marking the southern boundary for what will become the District of Columbia.
What happens in the laying of the cornerstone? And Washington scattered corn. You pour wine and pour oil. Now, corn stands for prosperity. Oil stands for peace, and wine stands for happiness.
You have Masons chanting in response to it. You have an oration afterwards, in which artillery is fired during the oration. So it's an extraordinary kind of ceremony.
According to scholars, the nation's capital has been steeped in ancient symbolism since its inception. And ancient astronaut theorists point to the city's tallest structure, the Washington Monument, as proof that the American capital was built with a deliberate eye to the stars. Although construction began in 1848, nearly 50 years after George Washington's death, the Freemasons built the Egyptian-style monument so that the constellation Pleiades would be visible directly over the giant obelisk.
The Pleiades is a group of 7 bright stars. For the Egyptians, they would use these stars as a way to figure out all sorts of judgments that needed to be made in many different things.
I find it fascinating that in the ancient world, in places of great power and great influence, they built monuments aligned with the Pleiades. So the fact that we find the Washington Monument also aligning with the Pleiades, is that coincidence?
In a city largely built to evoke ancient cities like Athens and Rome, is the dominant architectural structure based on an icon of ancient Egypt.
It is the largest obelisk in the world, 555 feet high. It draws the eye, and it draws the eye up. We have to ask, What did the Founding Fathers want us to see?
The idea of the obelisk is that it's frozen sunlight. They believed that the energy of the god Ra literally came through that antenna. The same concept is shown here in Washington, D.C., with the obelisk sitting in the center of Washington, or near the center of Washington, bringing that energy in from the stars and radiating it outward into the sacred precinct.
You have a reflecting pool. Why? To reflect the obelisk. Washington's monument points to the heavens. With the reflecting pool, it points below. There is a direct correlation between what happens here below and what's happening up there.
For ancient astronaut theorists, it's not just the placement of the Washington Monument and the Capitol building that point to the stars, but the layout of the entire city, which harkens back to ancient places like Egypt, Greece, and Rome.
Washington, D.C. is laid out perfectly straight lines radiating from different little hubs around the city. They converge on places like the Capitol building, the White House. It is a revelation of clarity that highlights the cornerstones of American democracy.
Washington, D.C. was conceived from the very beginning as a sacred space. In fact, it is a 10 by 10 square mile diamond matrix into which the Founding Fathers believed they could pour all their Enlightenment teachings and bring them to life within its capitals and its other buildings.
Another Freemason, Pierre Charles L'Enfant, was selected by President Washington to create a layout of the city within the 10-mile diamond of the District of Columbia. He began by aligning the corners of the square with the 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west.
It is not by coincidence. There is a scientific, rational way of developing the city of Washington with geometric shapes, circles, rectangles, triangles. And this is to emphasize that this new form of government was not going to rely on religion, but we're going to rely on reason and scientific discovery. And the design of the city reflects that. And there is absolutely no other capital city in the world that would design like this. There is no question that the main triangle at the heart of the city was very key, and connecting the Capitol to the White House and then to the Washington Monument.
Some historians believe that the triangle found in the center of Washington, D.C. represents the Masonic symbol of the square and compass, symbolizing the Founding Fathers' search for enlightenment from above. But ancient astronaut theorists claim that beyond this triangle lies an even more significant geometric shape, the shape of a pentagram.
The interesting thing about Jefferson's influence on the design of Washington, D.C. was the star, with rows emanating in all directions from the star that seemed to be a mirror of the heavens. Because Jefferson did believe that the heavens were inhabited, and he wanted Washington, D.C. not just to be the capital of the United States of America, but the capital of the universe.
George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were both expert surveyors and map makers, and were hands-on in the layout and design of the new Capitol.
George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who was an architect that built Monticello, laid out Washington, D.C. with the expectation that somehow, if there were extraterrestrials, they would see the image of the star at the center of the city and know this was a sign that we respected extraterrestrial life.